In 1945, the world finally exhaled for the first time in 6 long years. Adolf Hitler was dead, Nazi Germany lay in ruins, and Japan had surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The deadliest conflict in human history was finally over. Across Europe, American and Soviet soldiers, once bitter enemies, now stood side by side in the wreckage of Berlin. They shared cigarettes, traded watches, passed around bottles of vodka, and laughed like old friends. For a brief moment, it truly seemed like humanity had learned its lesson. Peace finally felt possible. But behind closed doors, something darker was already forming. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had never been built on trust. It was a marriage of convenience, held together by a single shared enemy, Nazi Germany. America was a capitalist democracy. The Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship. Their ideologies could not have been more opposed. While they fought together on the battlefield, both sides secretly prepared for what would come next. And once Hitler was gone, the glue holding them together disappeared instantly. Now a terrifying question stood before them both. Who would control the future of the world? By 1947, Europe was shattered beyond recognition. Entire cities had been flattened. Industries lay in ruins. Millions were homeless. Food was scarce. Inflation was out of control. Desperation filled the streets. This chaos became the perfect breeding ground for radical ideas, and the Soviet Union saw an opportunity. Communist parties began rising across Eastern Europe, promising workers equality and stability. One by one, nations slipped into Moscow's orbit, not always by choice, but through pressure, intimidation, and military presence. Washington watched nervously as Stalin tightened his grip. Then came the crisis that forced America's hand. Greece was in the middle of a brutal civil war. Communist rebels were fighting to overthrow the government. For years, Britain had supported the Greek government. But after World War II, Britain was financially broken. Their empire was collapsing. Their treasury was empty. In February 1947, the British government sent a blunt message to Washington. "We can no longer afford to help. You must take over." This was the moment everything changed. President Harry Truman now faced a decision that would reshape global politics forever. If America did nothing, Greece could fall to communism. Then Turkey might follow. Then Italy. Then France. US officials feared a domino effect. Once one country fell, others would collapse after it. This theory would dominate American foreign policy for decades to come. On March 12, 1947, Truman stood before Congress and delivered a speech that would echo through history. He announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine. In simple terms, Truman declared that the United States would support any nation threatened by communism, financially, militarily, politically, no matter the cost, no matter the location. It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. This wasn't just a speech, it was a global declaration. From that moment forward, the United States positioned itself as the defender of the non-communist world. It drew a line in the sand. Any Soviet expansion would be met with resistance, not with direct war, yet, but through money, weapons, and influence. The world was instantly divided into two camps: capitalism versus communism, democracy versus dictatorship, America versus the Soviet Union. The Cold War had begun. Joseph Stalin watched this unfold with deep suspicion. To him, the Truman Doctrine was a threat. He believed the West was trying to encircle and choke the Soviet Union. He remembered the devastation of Nazi invasions and vowed never to be vulnerable again. His response was swift and brutal. Across Eastern Europe, pro-Soviet governments replaced democratic ones. Opposition leaders disappeared. Elections were rigged. Secret police terrorized citizens. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. An iron grip fell across the region. Winston Churchill would later describe it perfectly. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Europe was now split in two. But Truman wasn't finished. In 1948, he approved the Marshall Plan, sending billions of dollars to rebuild Western Europe. Factories reopened, jobs returned, economies stabilized. It wasn't just humanitarian aid. It was strategy. Strong economies were less likely to embrace communism. Stalin immediately rejected the plan and forced Eastern European nations to refuse it as well. He claimed it was American imperialism. In reality, he feared losing control. The divide became permanent. Then came Berlin. Germany had been divided into 4 occupation zones after the war: American, British, French, and Soviet. The city of Berlin, deep inside Soviet territory, was also split. When Western powers attempted to unify their zones and introduce a new currency, Stalin snapped. In June 1948, he gave another order. Every road, railway, and canal into West Berlin was blocked. His goal was simple: starve the city into submission and force the Western powers out. But Truman refused to back down. Instead, he ordered the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, American and British cargo planes flew non-stop, landing every 30 seconds. They delivered food, fuel, medicine, and coal. Children waited on rooftops to wave at pilots who dropped candy. Against all odds, West Berlin survived. Stalin backed down. The Cold War had its first major showdown, and no one fired a single shot. But the tension never disappeared. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. America no longer had a monopoly. The world now lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. Soon after, China fell to communism. Then came the Korean War. Then Vietnam. Proxy wars erupted across the globe. Coups toppled governments. Spies hunted each other in shadows. Assassinations changed history. Every crisis traced back to that moment in 1947, when Truman drew the line. The Cold War was never fought like traditional wars. It was fought through influence, fear, and power, in underground bunkers, in intelligence agencies, in classrooms where children practiced hiding under desks, in space where rockets became weapons, in television broadcasts, propaganda, and political speeches. For 45 years, humanity lived with the knowledge that one mistake could end everything, all because of one order. Some say Truman saved democracy. Others say he created endless war. But one truth remains. That speech changed the world. Former allies became enemies. Friendships turned into rivalries. Peace turned into permanent tension. The Cold War didn't start with a bomb. It started with words.